Betrayal in front of our eyes. Judgment Day. I thought I'd arrive at the attorney's office early, but by the time my lawyer showed up and we were ushered into the conference room, Dave and his attorney were already there. This triggered the jealous reaction that always encompassed me when I saw him interacting with a beautiful woman. I suspected that deep down I always felt a little inferior to him. He was a brilliant catch for any woman. He was more handsome at 48 than he had been at 20, tall and muscular, owned his own successful business, and headed the local chamber of commerce. I shuddered at the thought that if today didn't go well, I'd never feel his big, soothing hands again. Dave barely looked at me as I followed my attorney into the room. My face, I know, went pale when the slender, red-haired, classically handsome attorney reached out and squeezed my husband's left forearm, just above the wrist, in a gesture of reassurance that she was there for him. Officially, she was just reassuring the customer. I, however, interpreted it as, let's get this garbage out of the way so I can drop you as a customer. I knew from long experience that if that happened, she was in for a big treat. My husband was gifted better than most. Dave turned to her and smiled his radiant, familiar, cheerful smile, but his face was neutral when he looked at me. I wanted to throw myself at his feet and scream that I was a stupid fool who would spend the rest of my life spoiling him. If only he would forgive me for the one serious mistake I'd made in our 28-year marriage. But frustrated by Dave's determination not to talk to me at all, I was forced to go to this meeting. My lawyer began chatting with the red-haired fool, while I sank down in the seat across from Dave, pulled a folder out of my large purse, opened it, and laid out the finished 2-page script in front of me. I looked up and saw Dave smiling weakly. Having known me for 30 years, he knew that I prepare in advance for anything important. He opened the laptop that lay on the table in front of him before plugging in a couple of small speakers, then placed one sheet next to it. Then, very casually, he put his hands on the desk and looked at me with a terribly polite face, totally emotionless. No anger, no hatred, no grief, no nothing. I had been preparing for this meeting for 3 days and knew my script by heart. I'd used my intimate knowledge of David Brown to adjust and tug at his heartstrings. At this point, both attorneys stopped talking and the fool brought the meeting to order. Well, we all know why we're here. The defendant, Mrs. Juliana Brown, has agreed to sign a divorce petition if my client David Brown will listen to her for at least 1 hour. If everyone is ready, I suggest that the hour begin right now. She turned the knob of the small kitchen timer on the table in front of her. It began ticking loudly, which emphasized the silence in the room. I was annoyed that Dave hadn't agreed to meet privately, but had insisted that the lawyers be present. I was going to bare my soul for the next 45 minutes before I got Dave to admit that he had done something to partially justify my unjustified behavior. It's all embarrassing enough when it's just the two of us present. All the more humiliating in front of outsiders. Well, no point dwelling on the negatives. I had no choice. I glanced at my completely unnecessary notes on the table and crossed my fingers. My friend Sonia had used my first gambit to convince her husband not to kick her out when he caught her cheating. Their egos are damaged, she said. Thanks for agreeing to meet with me today, Dave. I just wish I could say from the beginning that I was wrong in what I did, and it wasn't due to any failure on your part. But it all came down to me being a self-centered, selfish fool. It had taken me days of introspection to come to that conclusion, and I knew Dave would be pleased with my honesty. It was important to make it look like I was taking all the blame before subtly placing the thoughts he would probably put in his head. I firmly believed that Dave wanted to forgive me with all his heart, but he needed an excuse to do so. My whole speech was aimed at giving him that excuse. If the kids were home, I would play the "Dave, you can't destroy the family" card, which would give guaranteed success. I glanced at his face to see how he took my speech and was stunned by his reaction. In the ticking silence of the room, the expression on Dave's face was still neutral. He didn't even look at me. He simply picked up his pen and checked the box next to the first sentence of his notes. This almost completely confused me. With my first words, I had obviously said exactly what he expected me to say, and it shook my confidence. In my arrogance, I forgot that not only had I come up with my argument based on 30 years of knowing him, but he had spent those 30 years looking back at me. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was overwhelmed. Well, I have to keep sticking to my script. Like I said, Dave, it was all because of me and some stupid, selfish choices I made. I was feeling lost for lack of children and a little old, unattractive, and useless when I met Jason while serving on a church committee. He was sophisticated and obviously a skilled seducer. He knew exactly what buttons to push and when. He started pretending he was just a friend, listening to all my problems after church meetings. This was last year when you were away a lot. But one day we left the church right after the meeting and Jason suggested we go to a coffee shop, and I foolishly agreed. It all seemed so harmless and he seemed like a good friend. So I didn't realize he was very adept at getting under a woman's skin. Well, coffee shops led to restaurants where he complained that his wife didn't understand him. I know it's an old cliché, but by then I trusted him. The restaurants got fancier and fancier, the gifts he bought me got nicer and nicer. Dave, you have no idea how nice it is to have a guy 15 years younger than you trying to court you. But you'd be proud of me, because 4 months ago he asked me to sleep with him and I turned him down. I know I should have refused to see him after that, when his intentions were clear and all. But by then I had become partly dependent on the effect his compliments and attention had had on my ego and confidence. I stopped talking and sniffed my nose, rubbing my eyes with the finger I'd used earlier to rub the piece of onion in my pocket. It stung so badly that I didn't dare rub the other eye. One eye from which the tears were streaming would have to suffice. I stopped, started again, stammered and hesitated. Honey, I'm so ashamed I didn't break up with him. He took me to a restaurant and bought a bottle of Grange for $300, even though he doesn't drink wine himself. Instead of wasting it, I drank almost all of it. I'm pretty sure that's what he wanted. I was too uncoordinated to resist him when we left the restaurant. He offered to drive me home and I stupidly agreed. Once in the driveway he leaned in and kissed me, but I was too drunk to stop him. You know how I feel after a couple glasses of wine. Then he started rubbing my breasts. At this point my logic was completely broken, and I remember just thinking I had to get him out of the driveway so the neighbors wouldn't see us. For the same reason, I opened the garage door and made him park inside. I was a bit of a liar when I admitted that even in the car I thought Jason might be staying for a while, and I certainly didn't want the neighbors to see the strange car in the driveway the next morning. But it was all a calculated risk on my part. I knew enough about men in general to know that getting horns is a serious blow to a man's ego, and I wanted Dave to be sure that no one else would ever find out about it, well, unless you count the 2 lawyers. Well, Jason got out of the car as the garage door was about to close and started kissing me again. Like I said, I had already drunk most of the bottle of Grange and was ripe for plucking him. He grabbed my key and led me inside. I took him to one of the spare bedrooms, and I'll be ashamed of this until the day I die. Let him do whatever he wanted to me. I'm so sorry, Dave. My only saving grace is that I was with him enough to get him to put on protection. After we made love, I think we both fell asleep, me because I was drunk and him because he must have been tired after a 4 or 5 month chase. I know for a fact that I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't been drunk and depressed when I woke up, and I definitely would have kicked him to the curb immediately. Instead, you walked in. When you walked into the room and turned on the light, I've never been so embarrassed in my life. The look of pain on your face just killed me. I realized how much damage I had done to you and us with one simple slip-up. With tears still streaming from one eye, I turned a pleading gaze to my husband. Having spent a lifetime together, I knew I could read the expression on his face like an open book and would be able to judge how my plea was progressing. Not true. His facial expression still remained neutral. In fact, he wasn't even looking at me. Strangely, he was fiddling with the laptop in front of him. I thought he was writing notes until he clicked on a link on his screen. A voice came from the speakers, my voice. You don't kiss me, you stink of beer. How about you? Rotten great breath. What? I had one lousy glass of white. The audio clip stopped, and there was a thunderous silence in the room. I think that's what it was. The roaring sound in my head drowned out everything else. Yes, I'd felt embarrassed and humiliated when Dave had caught me that night with Jason. Before lifting Jason up by the hair and beating the hell out of his naked body. But that was nothing compared to the fact that I had just been caught in a huge lie. It completely threw me off balance. I was so sure my scenario would work. My eyes ran around the room. The fool. Dave's lawyer smiled slightly. Mine looked slightly embarrassed. Dave just stared at me, waiting with that damn blank expression. Later, I'll never understand why I didn't immediately realize what it all meant. Dave had an audio tape of me meeting Jason that night. Being wound up, it hadn't occurred to me to follow the logic of that. Why would he have a tape recorder there if he didn't know ahead of time that he could record something? What else were we talking about? The silence stretched awkwardly long, and I looked at the cryptic shorthand of my notes, and looking back stupidly, plunged into the prepared script. I clung to it like a drowning man clings to wreckage. It was a one-time thing. It would never happen again, nothing like that. Please believe me. I just wasn't strong enough to resist him, but I wasn't so out of control that I couldn't force him to use protection. He'd wanted to do that, but I would never do it no matter how drunk I was. We were in Megan's old room, weren't we? Dave just looked at me sadly, and I didn't know which was worse, his sad face or his impassive one. He shook his head and turned back to the computer. I felt, rather than heard him double-click the icon, and I cringed until I just love looking at your body, it's really hot. Then, just as it ended, another double-click and then Jason's voice again. When can I make love to you in your stupid husband's bed again? That was so cool. This time, Dave clicked and cut off the clip, then just looked at me, silently, accusingly. What could I say? Everything I said was blown out of the water. Not by Dave, but by my own words. Contraceptives, it was a one-time drunken mistake, not to horn in on my husband in his own bed. All exposed as lies in just 30 words, tick tick tick. I was at a loss for words. Although it was embarrassing, I looked at Dave, searching for some kind of clue. His neutral gaze still gave nothing away. Through my side vision, I noticed my lawyer glance at her watch. It made me focus on the loudly ticking timer, and the realization that the 60 minutes I had bought to try to get my marriage back were flying by fast, and I had to admit, spectacularly bad. I forced myself to suppress my panic. Sorry about the lie, Dave. About the first time, I mean. I just didn't want to hurt you any more than I already had. I thought if I could convince you that it was just a one-time thing, and for exactly the reason I said, you wouldn't be so hurt. I stumbled back to silence. Should I admit now that I'd been seeing Jason several times a week for over 6 months? The trouble was, I didn't know what Dave knew. He knew from recorded conversations that the night he walked in on Jason, and I wasn't the first or only night he'd been with me. But what else did he know? The fact that he'd hidden the recorder where I usually did with Jason suggested that he suspected at least one more time. I just didn't know. I did know, however, that if I got caught in one more lie, it would be over. Well, Julianne, old girl, it's time to be vague, avoid details, and stick to the facts. The truth is, Jason did seduce me, and it took some time. He has a weakness for older women, and it's true that a woman my age gets a huge ego boost being pursued by a man almost the age of her children. And I just wasn't strong enough to resist. I admit it, I was weak. I wondered if I should tell him I'd only used the master bed once, and that was the first time. It would be a lie, but one that would make me look much better. But I kept coming back to the fact that I had no idea how long Dave had known about my extramarital activities. I decided to remain silent on the matter. Tick tick tick. However, I can't remain silent on every issue. I had very little time to change this disastrous situation. Not knowing what to do, I looked at my notes. Discarding the first few paragraphs after I was exposed, I focused on a couple of words I capitalized. But I never stopped loving and respecting you, Dave. I've never given you less love than I always have. Jason was just an extra dimension in my life that took nothing away from you. Just overwhelming, if I can describe it that way. When I stopped talking, Dave looked at his laptop screen again. He frowned. He seemed to be struggling to find something. And for a split second, his expression changed from neutral to confused. But then he relaxed again. Hearing the recording, a continuation of the soundtrack he'd made earlier, I realized his frown meant he was looking for an icon on the screen before realizing it was one of the files already open. I wish he hadn't realized that. He was clearly starting over from the beginning of the clip. I listened again to Jason's question about making love to me in the marital bed. Just like the first time, I cringed. Once again, my own words condemned me. I've told you before, never again. I slumped even lower in the seat, knowing what words would follow next. Saying them made me feel smug, but I wasn't anymore. You have to admit, doll, that your husband acts like an ignorant jerk sometimes. How did we get away with it that time he came home early and I had to hide in the closet? What a jerk. Yeah, but he's my jerk. When we first started our case here, I thought it was cute that he trusted me so much that he never saw even the most obvious evidence. Now, however, I agree with you, he's just an ignorant jackass. Sometimes I wonder if you and I could have made love right here while he was in our room and see if he noticed. The sneer in my voice, as well as the words themselves, made me realize I was beating a dead horse here. With those words and that tone, I couldn't even convince myself that I loved and respected my husband, let alone him. Once again, I was thrown into a steady corkscrew of confusion. Before this meeting, I had convinced myself that I loved and respected Dave. But after what I had done and said, how was that possible? Tick, tick, tick. In the ticking, tense silence after the last nail in my coffin, Dave turned to look at me. I couldn't face him, so I turned to look at his lawyer. There was such contempt on her face that I even flinched. If I had any doubts that Dave was more than just another client to her, they were blown away by the emotion in that expression. I took my gaze away from her and now looked at my lawyer. She wasn't quick enough to hide her contempt either. So here I am in a room, fighting for my future, surrounded by people who think I'm something they stepped into at the dog park. And one of them should be on my side. My confidence has evaporated like dew in the midday sun. My self-esteem wasn't far behind. Maybe that's why I went over my notes one more time and decided to go on the offensive. You have to admit, Dave, that over the last 6 months or so you've been paying less and less attention to me, taking me for granted, going out of town more and more on business, and dare I say it, distancing yourself from me. And all this at the very time when the kids left home and I felt lost. You were never there for me when I needed you. You didn't tell me that I wasn't as old and unattractive as I felt. You weren't there to comfort me when I needed it most. I paused and Dave's gaze returned to his damn screen. His fingers danced again and I cringed. The file he'd chosen opened as Jason spoke. I realized it was right after our second round of lovemaking that horrible night shortly before Dave tore us apart. Sorry, doll, but we hadn't been together for almost 2 weeks. Ooh, you know I like it rough. No, seriously, 2 weeks is too long. Can't we see each other more often? Stop whining. It's been 2 weeks for me too. And I have needs too, especially after you asked me to cut Dave's diet. He had a 3-day trip planned last week and we could have snuck away somewhere. But the trip was cancelled at the last minute. You only made love to me tonight because of an urgent meeting he had to go to. I wish he'd get out of town more often too, honey, believe me. Well, I want more, Jason said, irritated. You'll get what I give you. Once again, the clip was interrupted. Embarrassed, I lowered my eyes to the table to avoid the 3 judgmental stares and remembered my state of mind during the last conversation. The truth was that the novelty of having a lover, even one as young and energetic as Jason, was beginning to wear off. Jason and my actions betraying my husband had caused me to lose respect for Dave, and that at the very least was beginning to torment my conscience. The loss of respect more than anything, I think, was the reason for my emotional estrangement from my husband. Even as I was preparing for this meeting, fully intending to blame him for pulling away from me, I realized it was a sham. To allow myself to continue betraying him, I was emotionally divorcing Dave. Cutting him off in bed was an easy decision simply because Dave's loving caresses were so different from Jason's impatience that it was impossible to confuse the two. It reinforced to me that what I was doing was very, very wrong. So I started rejecting my husband's advances. Well, he pushed for a while, then he stopped. Suddenly, I realized that it should have been screaming, demanding my attention months ago. Dave suddenly gave up his love life around the same time he started working longer hours and going away more often. At the time, I thought he was emotionally distancing himself from me too. I closed my eyes, now completely confused about who was distancing himself from whom, and then something clicked. Dave must have known a long time ago. That's why he knew to hide the recorder in Megan's room. My whole approach to this meeting was to minimize my crime, cure Dave's wounded pride, eat some humble trash, all to reclaim my life and the future I so desperately wanted. I thought I was soothing a recently wounded bull. But if I was right about what he'd known at least 2 weeks before he discovered, nay, confronted me, then he was far more devious than I'd thought. And I was wasting my time appealing to his emotions. Tick, tick, tick. Long story short, I had no idea what to do. I'm much better when I plan than when I'm spontaneous, hence the 2 pages of notes. But I had to do something, time was running out. The ticking of the clock confirmed it. In desperation, I picked up my notes and looked for hope. The pounding in my head made absorbing words a very slow process. Nothing popped out. Then I realized that the notes were a distraction as the game had changed dramatically. If Dave knew I was going away for a while, what was his state of mind? He certainly resented my betrayal, but he was more concerned about my motivation than anything else. Was I not satisfied with the quantity and quality of his love? Did I find him boring? Was I in love with Jason? Was I really going to run away with him? These fears and doubts I could fix. I risked looking into those expressionless eyes, wondering if I should risk another lie. If only I could remember what else Jason and I had talked about that fateful night. If only I could be sure it was the only night David had recorded. Surely the sequence must have been suspect, set up recorders, confronted. He couldn't be sure for long. He just wasn't a good actor. I desperately wanted to convince him of the truth. I still loved and respected him. My desperate wish that he wouldn't leave me was proving it. It was far beyond my fear of losing his very comfortable lifestyle. But how could I convince him that I respected him after we'd all heard me call him a jerk in front of my lover? What was the point of trying to justify denigrating him in front of my lover as a handout to my conscience and creating a common bond between Jason and me? Nothing that I could see. The same was true of loving him. If I caught him cheating on me, the wild horses wouldn't be able to draw the conclusion that he still loved me. So convincing him that I loved and respected him would take time. Time bought by convincing him not to insist that I sign the divorce papers right away. But how long would it take for the damn timer to tick to convince him of that? One thing was for sure. My next few sentences were going to score points, a lot of points. I gathered my wits and looked across the table at Dave. I know you feel like I've lost my love and respect for you, Dave, but I assure you I never have. I love you and our life together. I want to end my days with you and only you. After seeing what life is like without you and remembering the shame I felt when you caught me, I will hold myself together for the rest of my life, of that you can be sure. Jason was a distraction, a little sugar hit when I craved an ego boost. I didn't love him, and I certainly never intended to run away with him. Yes, it was wrong, very wrong, especially in response to his suggestion to make less love to you. I really don't know why I went along with it, especially after I managed to convince myself that I was just giving him an excess that you couldn't handle. He had no more stamina in bed than you did at his age, and he was far less experienced and attentive. I wasn't motivated by anything but selfishness. It was an ego trip. Yes, it was nice to make love before my body lost interest in sex, but it was completely passionless. I stopped when, without taking his eyes off me, Dave's fingers pressed the button they must have hovered over in anticipation. They say time slows down for those near death. The breakdown of a marriage must be the same, because I saw everyone else as if in slow motion, even though I was at normal speed myself. My lawyer, who was sitting to my left, threw her pen down on the table and turned to me. An expression of absolute disgust contorted her face, proving that at this point I couldn't even pay someone to be on my side. Dave's lawyer leaned to the side to get a better view of the laptop screen. That's when I realized that Dave wasn't playing sound files as I had assumed, but video clips. Somehow that made it even worse. Jura grabbed her husband's arm again as a sign of physical support. Dave's reaction couldn't have hurt more, even if he tried. Thankfully, he wasn't looking at me but at the screen in front of him. His neutral expression disappeared, but only for a split second. I could see the devastation he must have felt when he discovered that the man who was supposed to have his back was sneakily betraying him. I saw a lone tear roll out of the eye closest to me as he agonized. Or was he steeling himself by staring at the screen? The last remnants of my mind registered a couple of now irrelevant facts. The recording had been made at least 3 weeks before the collision, which meant Dave had been watching me betray him for some time. Enough to see a pattern. I stared at the table while my lawyer spread out the divorce papers in front of me. There was nothing I could do or say to combat the despicable behaviors my husband, my Dave, had discovered in me. Then, with consummate ease, he destroyed all my rationalizations, minimizations, and pathetic attempts at reconciliation. We were done. Like an orchestra conductor, Dave didn't say anything today, just indicated which section of the orchestra he wanted to play in next, utilizing his skills and talents. Dave didn't say a word and he executed me. No, not Dave. Yeah, I climbed the scaffold myself, put my own blindfold on, threw the noose on and kicked the lever. Dave just built the scaffold and walked away. I realized I didn't stand a chance as soon as he turned on the last clip without hesitation or looking. He knew exactly what I was going to say and when. I made up my arguments based on my intimate knowledge of him after watching him for 3 decades. I'd forgotten that he'd been watching me for a similar amount of time too, looking back at me with his intelligent, penetrating eyes. The shame and humiliation was unbearable and finally triggered my flight response. Escape was what I needed. Escape back to the house that was still my home, at least until Dave got the eviction notice that was part of the agreement. Fleeing to the children who would hopefully never find out and would continue to love me unconditionally. The only escape route was through a receipt with the loss of most of my life. I picked up a pen, signed the 2 agreements and in one smooth motion dropped it. I was surprised that Dave's business wasn't worth more, but that's what my attorney's appraisal had found. And of course Dave had had plenty of time to cover up most of it. Asshole. By this time, thankfully, the last entry was over and the ticking silence returned. My lawyer took the signed papers, handed 1 copy to the fool, and slipped the rest into her briefcase, stood up and left the room. I sat there frozen, wanting to run but wanting to leave with a positive message. A smoldering ember that would at least convince me that there was